The year is 1975. You're a 21-year-old woman, and you're faced with the potentiality of your own demise, as Yoshiko might have put it. You spent a year in hospital wondering whether you'd live or die, pondered upon the fragility of life, the purpose of art, and your place in the world. You reached the conclusion that there is no place for you in the world. It's a scary, lonely place. But who says you have to exist in this world? Who says you can't just create your own? That's exactly what Yoshiko did. Armed with a willing cameraman, she strode into Narrow Park and stood amidst the dark, windy moor, fingers tangled in red thread while the long grass looms behind her. The sky is a mix of purple and blue, indicating an otherworldly sentiment. With the shift of a single finger, the image was immortalized. It is this image that defines Yoshiko's breakout album, Mangekyou. Now, I am just a common British pleb who lives in England, so I can't film in Narrow Park for max effect, but I can film here at my local park, so here I am. Mangekyou is the Japanese term for kaleidoscope, which funnily enough can be considered in a few different senses. I'm going to consult my old friend Wikipedia for a basic definition. A kaleidoscope is an optical instrument with two or more reflecting surfaces tilted to each other at an angle so that one or more parts of objects on one end of these mirrors are shown as a regular symmetrical pattern when viewed from the other end due to repeated reflection. In other words, a kaleidoscope by definition is multifaceted. Illustrating one's anxieties around womanhood in an album named Kaleidoscope shows that there isn't any one anxiety, nor is there any one solution to the emotions that she feels. Anyone who went to McDonald's as a kid might remember that they once did a kaleidoscope tour in the Happy Meals. Maybe that's just a me thing, whatever. But kaleidoscopes are a common object of fascination for children. As adults, we tend to romanticize our time as children. Why wouldn't we? We don't have to worry about bills, relationships, what comes next after education. Yoshiko would agree with us there. She's always found nursery rhymes and fairy tales fascinating, particularly the way in which they are often rooted in cruel, heart-wrenching stories, despite being presented as fun little sing-alongs for kids. Ring-a-ring-a-roses, anyone? The duality between this peace and cruelty has always fascinated her, and so by using an object which is simultaneously viewed as a children's toy and a scientific tool, she aims to pick apart the anatomy of melancholy through the fantastical world of a child. Yoshiko's first foray into the music world as a Kyoto-based musician came in the form of Akai Hana, which would later become the 7th track on her album Mangekyou. The lyrics were published in Shinshu Journal in March 1975, 5 months before the official release of the album. It is worth noting that there are significant differences between the album version and single version. The single version features drum, bass, and even an orchestra. The album version in comparison is much more stripped down, perhaps because Yoshiko wanted the focus to be on her words rather than background details. Whatever the musical differences may be, the lyrics remain the same. The first line for each verse is the same. A red flower falls and bleeds on the surface of the water. The repetition, apart from mirroring the structure of children's nursery rhymes, serves to reinforce that basic fact that many young girls struggle to face. Sooner or later, they will have to grow up. A girl's first period is emblematic of that realization. This is the sentiment that Yoshiko embodies in Akai Hana, expressing her desire for camellia flowers as a symbol of innocence. Even as she confidently asserts that she is no longer a child and she has no use for a Ken doll, by the song's end, she's declared that in all truthfulness, she doesn't want to grow up. The song contrasts the themes of want and must. She wants to cling on to her innocence. She wants to be a child, but she must grow up and she must eat red rice. She states, "I don't like it, but..." And that but hangs in the air, demonstrating how her wants aren't actually all that relevant. As a child, she is made to bend to the will of the adults around her. We get the sense of powerlessness and hopelessness in this song, and the constant repetition of "a red flower falls and bleeds on the surface" only serves to reinforce this inevitability of what it means to grow up. In this context, Preparing the red rice can be emblematic of preparing for marriage. This mirrors how in many cultures, a girl's first period is seen as her becoming a woman, and therefore being suitable for marriage. This track was inspired by Yoshiharu Tsuge's comic of the same title. It's set in a fantastical land which can't be limited to any particular town, and it's written in a dialect which doesn't pertain to any particular region. These are themes which can be witnessed throughout the entirety of Mangekyou, as well as the rest of Yoshiko's discography. The heroine is Sayako Kikuchi, who reaches her first period and becomes an adult. Her menstruation sets the background for the love story between her and Masaji Shinden, a child who plays pranks on her but also has a faint crush on her. Red flowers are blooming mysteriously on the riverbank. Masaji spots Sayako going into the river alone. Then, unexpectedly, he saw a mysterious red flower flowing in front of his eyes as if dancing in a mountain stream. Setting menstruation in the background of a natural stream, amidst nature, demonstrates an attempt to get away from the misogynistic beliefs of periods making women impure. That was the intent of the original work by Yoshiharu, and it seems that Yoshiko intended to build upon this by introducing her own perspective as a young girl. Rather than it being the building block for a romantic story between a boy and a girl, it is the building block for a girl realising her place in the world and grappling with her own wants and desires. In other words, Yoshiko is given a voice to a demographic which is often forgotten about, neglected and treated as insignificant. Period poverty is a silent epidemic impacting 1 in 10 girls in the UK and almost just as many in Japan. Even when listening to this track in 2024, almost 50 years after it was released, not a lot has changed in that aspect. Young girls continue to be taught that they should be ashamed of their bodies. Yoshiko embodies the spirit of her younger self, exploring these complex emotions and coming to the conclusion that she doesn't want to grow up after all, and yet, the red flower will still fall and bleed on the surface every month, just like clockwork. Time passes. We have survived our treacherous teens, and we are approaching the age of adulthood. Nowadays in Japan, children become adults at the age of 18, but at the time Mangekyou was written, the age of adulthood was 20, and so this lays the foundation for Hatachi ni nareba, when I turned 20. Being a 20-year-old woman myself, this song was the catalyst in me deciding to embark on this project, translating, analysing and compiling information on a random 70s album in a language I can barely speak. I saw myself mirrored in the lone, ghost-like woman, who takes on many a form throughout the course of Mangekyou, the only consistent thread being the loneliness she feels as she realises that the world isn't what she imagined, and yearns for a different time in a different world where birds flutter on the ground and the sky bleeds green and not blue. Hatachi ni nareba, when I turned 20. As a woman approaching adulthood, you're thinking about all the things you'll finally be able to do. Discover the joys of cheap beer, wine, sake, whatever your poison is. Make out with some guy in a club who you'll never see again. Reinvent yourself fully. It should be a time for self-exploration where you figure out who you are, what you want from life, and how you're going to get it. But when cuffed in the unforgiving chains of patriarchy, there is no room for any of that. In Yoshiko's otherworldly land, the path is set in stone. Quit your unladylike vices, get married, and cut your hair so as not to attract the attention of anyone who isn't your lazy, slovenly husband. And then you will exist as a baby-producing vessel for the rest of your days, living surrounded by children and then dying. Riveting stuff, right? In Hatachi ni nareba, the only thing anchoring Yoshiko to freedom, an escape from the melancholy that awaits her, is the one vice she cannot seem to let go of: smoking. She expresses a desire to quit smoking throughout all 4 verses. It is worth reflecting on the cultural significance of smoking for Japanese women. It has been historically viewed as a form of deviant behaviour due to it being traditionally masculine. However, it is nowadays seen as a symbol of women's emancipation and empowerment. This is why this desire to quit smoking is so prevalent. She knows that getting married means giving up her emancipation, but because she repeats it and never does it, we can see that she is indeed still clinging onto the idea of being a free woman. Yoshiko herself said this in relation to the philosophy that drives her as an artist. In the 1970s, a lot of women graduated and then focused on marriage. I wanted to protest against this and prove I could be an independent woman. Considering that to this day, she remains a single unmarried woman in her 70s with a successful music career and a loyal following, we can see that this is a woman who knows how to stand on business. This song is not meant to be viewed as an idyllic pondering on a woman's 20s, but rather a condemnation of how women are socially coerced into discarding their identities for the approval of others. Taking such a strong position in the mid-70s is definitely a radical action on her part, but given the dropping marriage rate and birth rate in Japan, perhaps we can say she was ahead of the curve. Don't be fooled by the archaic Japanese and the mystical vibes in her music. She's a modern woman through and through. Although Akai Hana was the first song she introduced to the public, when she released this double-sided vinyl, it was Hatachi ni Nareba on the A side and Akai Hana on the B side. The inversion of both songs is interesting when you consider that thematically, you'd expect each milestone of womanhood to go in a linear order. First period, then first taste of adulthood. What possible reason could she have for inverting their order? Only she knows ultimately, but if you were to ask me, I'd say that given that she was 21 at the time of release and in her final year of university, Hatachi ni Nareba felt that much closer to her. She may have been reflecting on her 20s thus far, seeing what other young women her age were doing, and feeling caged in by the inevitability of marriage and having to sacrifice her own dreams of becoming a creative. By releasing Hatachi ni Nareba as her A-side, she boldly declares to the public, "I will not cave, I am an independent woman." And Akai Hana builds upon that desire to explore the trials and tribulations she's faced growing up as a young woman in Japanese society. Given that the order reverts to Akai Hana, followed by Hatachi ni Nareba in the official album release, it is evident that this choice for the vinyl single was about sending a message more than anything else. A few months pass. It is Monday the 25th of August, 1975. The summer is closing out and giving way to autumn. The hungover salarymen are dragging themselves out of bed and heading to work. Students who stayed up late doing all sorts drag themselves into school. They're sleep deprived, craving their bed. And if you're Yoshiko Sai, you're a final year student who's just released your debut album, Mangekyou. The first track we hear is Yoru no Se, Night Spirit. Our female protagonist finds herself outside at night, where she encounters a night spirit on a street corner. It is in this moment she realises how even the most ordinary of towns can become strange, enchanting places in the right circumstances. In each verse, there is a battle between light and darkness, and in an album such as this, darkness reigns supreme, of course. It is this darkness that will characterise the rest of the album, as well as the loneliness our female protagonist experiences. This night spirit could be seen as a sliver of hope, depending on how you choose to read it. In some folk traditions, old camellia trees are said to turn into ghosts, and so on this lonely street corner, where our protagonist is alone and feels that her words are meaningless, this night spirit comes as a shining beacon of hope, a camellia flower that, while old, may offer a shred of wisdom to this directionless girl. However, she continues to wander in the second track, this time through a winter underpass, which, coincidentally enough, is the name of the track. As Yoshiko puts it, I just wanted to write the atmosphere of walking through an underpass in winter, where I walked every day to and fro the train station nearby. I felt so cold and alienated there. The third track is when these anxieties of coldness, isolation, directionless, all come to a head. Ōmagatoki, or witching hour, introduces woman in the form of a red flower that has reached maturity, becomes sullied by age, and is therefore destined for hell. She is sexualized against her will, being compared to a flower that leans seductively towards the future. And so, she finds her refuge in the sky where she clings to this dreamlike state of hers. However, in the final verse, the city is raped by the dripping red of the sky, and so it is no longer woman's refuge. Sunset, once an idyllic state, is now an act of violence. She may no longer retreat into herself during the witching hour. She may only watch as the sky fades to twilight. Specifically in reference to how the original Japanese is structured, we have 3 verses, 3 lines for each verse, and this is the 3rd track of the album. Everything about Ōmagatoki feels very intentional. Again, there's a sense of routine in the way it's written, but as the lyrics indicate a progression of some kind, we see that it could be a metaphor for the way that even as our society progresses, it continues to adhere to the structure laid out by patriarchy. The progression we get isn't a positive one either. The final verse depicts a symbolic rape. In terms of how the actual song is written, there is an extensive use of old-sounding Japanese. This immediately casts a very poetic sense over the text. Japanese is traditionally SOV, subject, object, verb, but Yoshiko opens with the verb, right from the beginning, in an inverted VOS structure. This is a brilliant bit of world building that serves to prolong the spell cast by her in Yoru no Sei, transporting us into this so-called crazy town. Ōmagatoki depicts a dystopian world where there are no safe spaces, and so all our female protagonists can do is dream. We stumble into the ramblings of a scorned lover in track 4, Koishita Hitoe, Dear Ex-Lover. This track depicts a one-sided conversation between our female protagonist and a selfish man who didn't care about her the way she cared about him. It is worth highlighting that it isn't necessarily clear whether we're still following the lonely girl in Ōmagatoki, or if we've shifted focus to a different unnamed female protagonist. This is a purposeful action on Yoshiko's part. She states that in terms of her songwriting processes, before I write a song, I let images come to me first, then I put them into words. I'm not sure if they have a concrete meaning or not. Given that the album is intended to give a voice to the common experiences of girls and women alike, it makes most sense that this lonely girl that we've been following the story of so far is not just a lonely girl. Rather, she is a spirit that may shapeshift in order to take on the roles of different girls and women at differing points in their lives. The spirit is not just a woman, rather, she is every woman. And so we are at the point in the story where we are considering a girl's first heartbreak, discovering that capacity within oneself to love and be loved, only to have your heart ripped out from your chest in the blink of an eye. Believing you and your ex-lover were long-lost soulmates, star-crossed lovers, lifelong partners. Such is the way of a girl's first love in life. I myself remain in active recovery from my first love, and I'm sure many of you watching this might find yourself in the same position. It's a near universal experience, loving, losing, and yearning. This female protagonist, whoever she may be, has experienced her first true love, and although the world wants her to think that she's delusional in believing it to be true love, she knows it was real because if it was a dream, she would have been able to wake up from it. Yet, she opens her eyes and is still hopelessly infatuated with this man, and so she leaves the city in the hope that she will eventually heal. After our female protagonist leaves her town with a vacant, burning heart, she finds herself in the setting of track 5, Tsubaki wa Uchitokoyo, or in other words, Has the Camellia Withered? Fun fact, the kaya in Uchitokoyo is pretty much impossible to translate into English, but it's like the verbal equivalent of a sad face, which I love. I really do think we should just start punctuating our sentences with sad face, koyo. Anyway, returning to the topic at hand. In this song, the scorned lover from Koishita Hitoe finds herself on the brink of suicide as she comes to terms with the fact that alcohol will not grant her a release from painful memories of the past. Suicide in Japan is a contentious topic. Given the stigma around mental health, many women end up keeping their negative emotions and stress inside rather than expressing them. It bottles up until they can no longer bear it, and then they take their own lives. In Japanese women aged 15 to 29, it is the leading cause of death. Comparing against other countries, suicide rates for Japanese women are unusually high. Japan had the second highest suicide rate among women globally, with 8.6 suicides per 100,000 women. In this song, Yoshiko extends a hand to those women. She says, "Let's do this together." Loneliness is no longer the theme. Now it is female solidarity, companionship. The plan of suicide is abandoned, and in its place comes a commitment to starting over again, rebirth rather than death. Once the depressive haze is lifted, Yoshiko asks, "Did you cry when you sobered up?" That is the story of many women, slaves to vices they cannot control. Within the context of this album, it flows on perfectly from the last track, where the love between our female protagonist and her ex-lover existed only through conversations and sake. Once the sake stopped flowing, so did the love. It also features a callback to Ōmagatoki, where our female protagonist is drunk on dreams. The dream has ended and now our protagonist is in reality, where she comes face to face with her own melancholy. Yoshiko invokes a religious reference in this song in verse 3, speaking of a swaying sea of blood that drifts towards a needle mountain of hell. This is a Buddhist interpretation of what hell would look like in the afterlife. If we take sea of blood as a metaphor for a menstruating woman, and this needle mountain of hell as a sacred Buddhist mountain, then this vivid imagery bursts alight with cultural significance. Women, whether they're actively menstruating or not, are completely banned from climbing the tops of sacred mountains due to their inherent quote-unquote impurity. So in a sense, Yoshiko's conclusion that this woman should crawl into the soil with an ashen interior shows that this woman has been rejected from this needle mountain of hell for her quote-unquote impurity. In other words, even if she tried to commit suicide, she would be denied heaven, and hell would also refuse to have her. Here, Yoshiko is presenting the dilemma that many religious women face. How am I to practice allegiance to a religion that hates me for being a woman? This woman with her ashen interior has experienced the fiery heat of hell, only to be expelled from it. This ashen interior line could also refer to the fact that the shedding of the endometrial lining is seen as a kind of death. Whichever interpretation we roll with, in both cases, this hell-bound woman can never actually make it to hell, and so she is stuck in an in-between state, or so one would believe. When Yoshiko extends a hand to this woman, she suggests that this woman should crawl into the soil so that she may have a second chance at life. We could read this ashen interior as a callback to this woman's vacant burning heart. Her heart has stopped burning, leaving an ashen interior, yet now she is ready to recover from her first love at long last. The story of this particular woman, bearing the stories of different girls and different women, seems to end here. Entering track 6, we find ourselves watching as the curtains open on the Yoidori Shibai, or in other words, a drunkard drama. This track serves to contrast the roles of men and women in this mystical patriarchal world which, funnily enough, mirrors ours fairly well. It says something that Yoshiko can envision a world where the sky bleeds red and green like a candy cane, and birds flutter without flying, but she can't envision a world in which patriarchy does not confine women. Patriarchy is the all-eternal force, so regimented that it appears to spring from a natural source. It does not. Something being naturalised does not make it a thing of nature, but that doesn't stop it from featuring in this otherworldly drunkard drama. We see an intoxicated ventriloquist, who is free to do as he wishes in his one-man performance, singing, drinking, and dreaming. He is solitary but free. His story is contrasted against that of a souled girl, who stands alongside a sad, sober man. It isn't explicitly stated, but we can assume that this girl has been bought by the man, and so she's neither solitary nor free. In a dark and uncertain life, her only hope lies in a shooting star. This shooting star takes us to the young girl depicted in Akai Hana, which is track 7 out of 10. As a single, it depicts the anxieties a young girl might experience around the idea of having her first period. As track 7, it is the mitochondria of the entire album, and the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Everything comes back to Akai Hana. There are mentions and allusions to camellia flowers in the colour red throughout the entire album, neatly setting the stage for our star single. Its impact within the album is that much more crushing, especially when contrasted against the stories of women who have found themselves at the brink of suicide, sold to strange men, and forced to leave their homes due to crushing heartbreak. With these fears illuminated in our minds, the fear the young girl in Akai Hana feels when faced with the prospect of growing up becomes that much more real. And our hearts break for her and for our own younger selves, wishing we could cling on to innocence in the form of a camellia flower, but knowing that this camellia flower has already withered. However, there is a challenge to this in the form of a simple verb used in Ōmagatoki, kare. This simultaneously means to wither and to mature, although to wither is the most common reading. Yoshiko's essentially invoking that age-old misogynistic trope of women hitting a wall as they get older. Has the flower actually withered, or has it just gotten older and is therefore viewed as less valuable? This is the question that is later posed in Tsubaki wa Tokoyo, has the camellia withered? And in Akai Hana, we find our answer. The flower hasn't withered, and it's just gotten older. In fact, it is this old camellia flower that we see on the street corner in the first track, wandering the streets as a night spirit. She's not withered, she's just aged. She is lonely, but she's free. And so, we progress on to Hatachi ni Nareba, track 8 out of 10. Our female protagonist is no longer worried about aging. She has accepted it and is now wondering what her 20s will look like. But this isn't necessarily because she's excited about it. Quite the opposite, actually. She seems to be numb. There is no assertion, no excitement. Yoshiko sings as if she's mourning. The protagonist's desire to marry is expressed in Japanese as kekon suru no. No is impossible to translate concisely into English, but it carries an incredible amount of weight in terms of decoding the protagonist's true feelings around marriage. Typically, Japanese women will end their sentences with no as a feminine inflection of sorts, intended to lighten what they're saying. However, this usually has a downwards intonation. If we listen to the way Yoshiko sings this, she sings no with an upwards intonation. This changes the sense from lightening to inquiring, introducing an element of doubt. We also get shinu no, maybe I'll die, in verse 4. The no here serves to highlight her disillusionment towards what awaits her in her 20s and beyond. In track 9, Yuki-onna, we are greeted with the tale of a snow woman who roams snowy mountains in search of unwitting male travellers, leading them to the shore of death and granting them comfort in their final moments. Her true nature is not clear. In one verse she is a fleeting cherry blossom. The next, she is a demonic woman. But what we know for sure is that the snowy mountains are her domain. What makes this track particularly curious is that it seems to be written from a male perspective, given the use of the male-gendered pronoun omae, rather than the gender-neutral anata. This makes it an anomaly of sorts in an album centered on female experiences. The Yuki-onna is a figure of Japanese folklore, and Yoshiko seeks to humanize her here. The intro presents her as being born of winter, meaning that these snowy mountains are her home. And the male intruders she encounters aren't victims, but intruders in the eyes of this Yuki-onna. This reading is supported by the fact that the speaker speaks of the Yuki-onna embracing him rather than killing him, as the myths would suggest. Verse 4 goes on to detail how men are overwhelmed with temptation at the sight of her, and it is perhaps because of their ill intent that she does away with them, rather than her being some sort of demonic woman. Here, we are encouraged not to trust the narration at face value and dig deeper to deduce the true nature of the Yuki-onna. Demonic seductress of death, or simply a woman of supernatural qualities who is tired of random men barging into her home and leering over her. Finally, we reach Mihatenu Yume, Unfulfilled Dream, the 10th and final track on Mangekyou. This is also going to be the longest analysis, but bear with me, I promise I will get to the point, I promise it will all come together in this final track, just stay with me. So, this song takes after Tsubaki wa Tokoyo, the halfway track of Mangekyou, in that Yoshiko takes on a mother-like role for a younger girl who is experiencing the same trials and tribulations as she did once upon a time. It could even be read as Yoshiko looking back at her younger self, given that it's called Unfulfilled Dream. What is that unfulfilled dream? What is the driving force behind the melancholy that haunts her to this day? In verse 1, she says, "I hope you'll be able to love your body." This marks the first time in the entire album that love is said in reference to oneself. Love has only existed in terms of heterosexual love between a man and a woman up until this point. Yet now, the speaker seems to have realised that self-love also exists, and is arguably more important, given that this is also the first and only time the word love is used in a positive sense. We progress to verse 3, where we hear the following lyrics. A human-like figure smiling from across the sea. A bloody green is wiped away from a still, unburdened sky, and you and I embrace each other. First of all, I love this so much. I love it. Second of all, let's dig a little deeper with this one. In the first line, rather than just saying human, Yoshiko adds the modifier modoki, which infuses a surreal element into the narrative. We get the sense that Yoshiko is no longer alive, but has taken on a human form in order to speak to this younger girl and encourage her to love herself. The mention of the sea takes us back to Fuyu no Chikado, which was inspired by Yoshiko's own walk as a young female university student by a winter underpass facing the sea. We get the sense that Yoshiko might be sitting at the grey wall of that underpass yet again, but rather than being a solitary woman who sits and draws the sky with a blue crayon, she has found company at long last. Fuyu no Chikado, randomly thrown in as a second track, finally finds its footing here. It is also worth considering how Yoshiko's priorities have changed. In Hatachi ni Nareba, the speaker expresses her desire to be held by a kind man. Yet now, this desire has shifted from a hypothetical man to a real existing girl right in front of her. She is no longer passive in wishing to be held, but she is active in wanting to embrace and be embraced. Returning briefly to the first verse, there is a bit of wordplay in Japanese, which lends a bit more insight into what is running through Yoshiko's mind in this moment. I will remind you all that my Japanese is not advanced, and so I might be chatting absolute bollocks here, but the song opens with the line, before it becomes a pipe dream, which in Japanese is e soragoto ni. If you're paying attention, you'll notice, hey, pipe dream and unfulfilled dream are the same thing, aren't they? Well, yes, they are. It's a trend that runs throughout the entire album. We'd be here all day if I were to pick up on each instance of this happening. But since this is the last and final track, I want to hone in on the significance of Yoshiko doing this here. Mihatenu Yume would usually be translated as impossible dream, indicating that it can never be fulfilled. But let's dig a little deeper into this. The Mihatenu in Mihatenu Yume comes from the verb mihateru, meaning to be seen through to the end. Switching out ru for nu negates that meaning, indicating that although that dream existed in the realm of possibility, it was never able to breach that gap between dream and reality. And so considering it an unfulfilled dream, something that could have been done and wasn't, is much truer to the sense that Yoshiko is getting at here. The possibility is slim, but it isn't impossible. Going on to use the term esoragoto in lieu of Mihatenu Yume in the actual lyrics gives us an indication as to why this dream of hers, said dream being self-love, remains unfulfilled. Esoragoto. If we were to read this as two words, we could theoretically translate this line as before the false image evolves, given that e means image and soragoto means false. What does reading this line in that sense tell us? Well, the most obvious thing that jumps out first is that if a false image evolves, is it evolving into a truth? Is it ceasing to be an image at all? It creates more questions than answers, but we're not meant to search for answers within this. Rather, it is a long-term consideration of sorts. In the same way philosophers tend to come up with more questions than actual answers, Yoshiko is essentially doing the same thing here. What is this false image? What does it mean for this false image to evolve? In what sense is it false? We don't know for sure. But if we consider the disillusioned woman from Hatachi ni Nareba, imagining a fantasy man who doesn't actually exist, perhaps this false image stands for the way young girls tend to perceive the world through rose-coloured lens before they actually grow up and realise that things aren't as simple and easy as they might seem. She's essentially saying, while you're still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, extend some of that youthful optimism towards yourself, and learn how to love yourself before you become jaded by the trials and tribulations of life. In accepting this interpretation, there is an implication that growing up as a woman isn't actually all that bad. Rather, it's when one's bodily changes are contextualized within society that we learn to hate ourselves. But it is a learned behaviour, a falsehood, and so it can be unlearned. That's not all though. Please, stay with me. I promise this gets juicier. Stay with me. The term Isuragoto contains the kanji for sky, which has remained a prominent theme throughout the album, and Yoshiko acknowledges this by lingering on that word sora, encouraging us to delve deeper into what is being said yet again. The sky has acted symbolically as a place of refuge for our young female dreamers, whether it be day, night, or twilight. And so the sky reappears here, this time with the purpose of contextualizing this girl's relationship with her body through nature. The purpose of this is to grant a path through which she may consider how to love herself, the way Yoshiko hopes she will. E sora goto ni, naru mae ni. Mae ni here simply means before, but eni can be read as fate between two people. In the same way Yoshiko lingers on that first sora, she does the same thing here, quietly placing emphasis in the places where we might dig deeper for answers. The two people in Mihatenu Yume are Yoshiko herself and a young girl who could or could not be her younger self. The theme here is one of unifying the self, coming to terms with the radical idea that, hey, I'm stuck with myself for the rest of my life. Perhaps I should make this an amicable union, rather than a miserable one. The word she uses for body, when expressing her desire for this younger girl to be able to love her body, is itai. This means different body, but it can also mean painful. It reflects that although going through puberty can be a painful experience emotionally for young girls, it is ultimately part of the process of becoming a woman and it should be embraced. This is why the album ultimately ends with an embrace. It is intended to inspire hope and remind us that as dismal as our lives may be, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Listening to this album has been a cathartic experience for me as a 20-year-old woman. I was 13 when I discovered it, experiencing the same fears as the young girl in Akai Hana, and now I am the 20-something wondering about how my 20s will look. I have experienced heartbreak, I have drowned my sorrows in alcohol, I have sought refuge in the clouds and refused to face reality. I listen to Mangekyou and feel that it was made with me in mind. Me, a 20-year-old black woman growing up in the UK, with English as my first language, not Japanese. Even before I understood the lyrics of this album and the cultural themes underpinning many of the songs, Yoshiko Sai's mystique pulled me in. Cobbling together what I could with the scraps I found online, I knew this was an album that would help me to articulate the key themes in my life and find direction in a world where compasses apparently don't exist. Crazy. Don't even ask me how to operate Google Maps. I'm the type of person who would try and get to Hollywood and end up in Hollywood, Birmingham. My point is, this is an album that manages to be personal, yet universal at the same time. Despite male critics who have derided Mangekyou as Yoshiko wailing in a field for 40 minutes, I can say this for sure. I'd like to see them wail in a field for 40 minutes. Go on, I'll give a bouquet of camellia flowers to the best male critic who pulls it off. Ready, set, psych. We're not here to focus on negativity. We are here to consider the anatomy of woman's melancholy. As a kaleidoscope, it is multifaceted. We find our melancholy in periods, which are strangers from our own bodies, mark us as being different from the boys we tussled with growing up. We are worth something now, but we are measured only in our value to men, not our value to the world. Beauty is the price we must pay as women just to be allowed to exist. If we are lacking in that currency, then we are abominable, hated. If we are plentiful in that currency, we are able to be sold like a commodity, while men continue on as they are. This knowledge of being different, the other, as Simone de Beauvoir might describe it, haunts us. Our understanding of ourselves becomes more fractured. We see our unhappy mothers and the carefree fathers. We drift from one city to another. The only remaining constant, the loneliness we feel in each and every new place. We are told that finding a kind man will allow us to become whole, and we embark on that journey towards our first love. Our first love crashes and burns. We're still hollow. Hollow and heartbroken. What now? Do we just end it all? But how do we end it all? What religion will welcome us to their holy paradise when they consider us tainted by virtue of being women? Whether it's hell on earth or hell in the afterlife, the result is the same. We are excluded, pushed out, not quite in, but not quite out either. We are night spirits, wandering in search of our place on the earth. But even when we have made our home in the world, it is never truly safe. We are at peril of random men wandering in with lustful fantasies, making us feel unsafe in our own homes, creating stories of us being demons, aggressors, seductresses, when we are just women keeping to ourselves and trying to live as we do. In all of these factors that comprise the anatomy of women's melancholy, as presented by Yoshiko Sai, the natural conclusion is to bond with those who understand the isolating experience of being a woman in a man's world, to talk about each other's experiences, to strive towards love of self and love of women, to embrace the women in our lives, to protect them, to listen to them. If all the lonely, isolated women of the world came together to embrace each other, then perhaps, just perhaps, there may be a cure to this seemingly perpetual melancholy.